So you're all very welcome. For any that don't know me, my name is Zara Duffy and I am Head of Northern Ireland at the Institute. I'm delighted to welcome over 300 of you have registered today to our third session with the Trader Support Service. Certainly seems to be a very hot topic, and we've had over 700 views on the first two webinars, and they are still available on our website if you want to look back. Just a couple of housekeeping points for today. So today's session is a little bit longer. It's going to be about 90 minutes long as we have a lot of material to cover. We will leave probably around 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. If you want to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. We will deal with some of those probably throughout the presentation, and any others we'll leave to the end. If we don't get to them all, we will endeavour to come back and answer those and follow up with you after the session. Like the first two sessions, today's session is also being recorded, so we will send a link and a copy of the slides to you by email afterwards. So it is fair to say, I think, that the UK's departure from the EU and the NI protocol have both brought about significant changes to the trading environment for many of our businesses, not least in the area of customs and VAT. Some of the customs formalities in particular have proven cumbersome for many traders. However, we are hearing from many businesses that they're beginning to adapt to the new trading environment as they work through the new regulations. And the opportunities for Northern Ireland under the protocol are becoming more apparent. The Institute continues to engage with HMRC and with other government officials to work through issues primarily relating to VAT and customs and the obligations connected with implementing the protocol. A few stats for you. Up until the end of February, official figures show that 34,000 businesses have registered for the TSS, 9,000 of those since the beginning of the year. The TSS has handled 68,000 reported goods movements from the beginning of the year, including 200,000 consignments. They have also had 17,000 inbound calls. There have been a number of enhancements to the TSS service, and this work is still ongoing. So the team are here today to look at some of these enhancements, and we'll cover areas such as the Supplementary Declarations, Groupage, Transit Services, and Indirect Exports, among other things. So I am delighted to welcome back today Shankar Singham and Frank Dunsmuir, who you will now all be familiar with. And they're also joined today by another colleague, Dan Garnon. You're all very welcome. And Shankar, I will hand over to you now to begin the presentation.
Thanks very much, Zara. So I think we've got a presentation that I think Shen is going to put on the screen for us. Yeah, so what we're going to do, we've got quite a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to run through this fairly quickly in the interest of getting some time at the end for questions. I'm going to sort of give you a quick recap on the Trader Support Service itself, some of our statistics and metrics. Now we've been running for over 2 months. I will recap the process for GBNI trade, because we have launched in release 2 on February the 15th, the Supplementary Declarations piece of this, which is the final bit of the import declaration. And I'll sort of explain that, and then I'll talk about our transit service, both GBNI and also how we are supporting NI to GB via Irish ports. Frank will talk about the consignment first option, which is the new mechanism, which is really tailored towards groupage hauliers. I will then talk about some very important developments in the area of the Simplified Frontier Declaration for both SPS controlled goods and other controlled goods, and what's happening on Monday. And then we'll talk about the supplementary declarations and the tariff options. And I think this particularly for accountants, this is a really important piece of the equation here for you and your clients. If we go to the next slide. So just a quick recap on what TSS is and isn't. We have now about 800 contact center agents. The way to use the contact center is the tier 1 agents will help you with registration, password, etc. Those basic things. There are tier 2 agents with at least 2 years of customs experience who can help you with slightly more simple customs questions. And then there are tier 3s and we have one of them, Dan, gone and on with us today. The tier 3s have at least 7 years of customs experience, but many of them have 20 or 30 years of customs experience, so that they can work on your more complex inquiries. And ultimately, if you need, you can escalate those, ultimately to Frank and myself. And I think we can certainly make available to everyone on the call our email addresses. If I can do that on behalf of both Frank and myself, hopefully we won't get too inundated with requests, but certainly we're able to answer those. And I think actually we very much want to answer those, because I think you as accountants are a critical part of this, making this whole process work. And so, answering your questions will be really helpful to us. We're not a personalized advisory service. We're not like you are. So where a client will go to a law firm or an accountant to sort of say, well, I'm moving goods from GB to NI, I have no idea how to do it. Can you tell me what customs, what should I be doing? That's really an issue for the existing intermediary market, for the accountants, for the law firms. We certainly don't want to, in TSS, hollow out that market. That we think that's a really important market, and TSS is temporary. We'll go in 2 years, and then it's the accountants, the lawyers, and the intermediaries who have to pick up the slack. So, really important that we don't hollow out that sector. But the Northern Ireland Customs and Trade Academy is essentially operating like a customs college or university with a range of free offerings. We've had probably 300,000 at this point, almost, downloads of NICTA material, which is up at the level of a college or a university or a massive online course sort of thing, and that is a totally free service from TSS. So really encourage you to use that material. We don't raise non-standard documentation, by which we mean the health certificates and the other licenses for controlled goods and so on. So that is done by the trader themselves. Now, there is a good movement advisory service in DEFRA, which will help answer questions about these things. And importantly, the UK government will pay for those certificates. Some of those certificates can be quite expensive. Phytosanitary certificate can be £1,000, but that is all paid for by the UK government. So if we go to the next slide. This is just a quick look at our metrics, and we'll make all these slides available to you after this event. What you're seeing is the declarations, the entry summary, and the entry summary declarations, which is the safety and security declaration, the first step of the process. We're getting a little bit of a jump up week beginning 22nd, 33,000 declarations. We've done over 230,000 since January 1, over 180,000 SFDs. And we're seeing a bit of an increase, I think, possibly because there was a large amount of inventory at the end of last year, and possibly because as people anticipate COVID restrictions being lifted, you're getting a bit more trade going in. So that number might continue to climb. And on the subs, 54,000 in the first 2 weeks of that going live. There is obviously a backlog going back to January the 1st of subdecks that need to be dealt with, and we are working with HMRC to figure out how to prioritize certain of the subdecks so we can get them moving through the system in the simplest possible way. It really is a digital first service. I mean, last week 80% of inquiries were online, and inbound calls are answered within 6 seconds on average. There's a lot of outreach the contact center is doing now to traders, particularly with the supplementary declarations. So they are calling traders directly to help them with the subdecks. We sent out a communication yesterday, because obviously today would be the day that the first set of subdecks have to be in, based on movements between February the 15th and now. What we've said in that communication is, first of all, with regard to the backlog, you don't need to worry about March the 4th for the backlog. But for the new February 15th and onwards subdecks, what we're saying is, look, if you're working with TSS and you're making a good faith effort to enter your supplementary declaration information, and for whatever reason you're just not able to do it by today, then we and HMRC will work with you, will be flexible and supportive of you. If you can do it, we urge you to do it. It's in your interest to do it, because then you can move on to the backlog and get yourself sort of regularized. I would say with subdecks, from a UCC standpoint, it's really important for your clients to understand that this is a single unitary declaration for the purposes of the UCC. This is not a TSS extra requirement, it's a legal requirement. And if you don't do it, you're not really doing it. You aren't doing an import declaration. Your import declaration is not legally compliant, it's not complete. And obviously there are major ramifications of that. So it is important to get it in. Trader registrations are very high. I mean, they're way higher than we ever imagined they would be. We're up to about 35,000 now, and that's more than a quarter of those registrations came in after January 1, which is the market telling us that the system does work. So if you go to the next slide. On the entry summary declarations, the profile, I think you can see now this is now pretty much a set pattern. Daily peaks, 1,800 movements, middle of the week. We're sort of seeing this, and it probably will go up a bit with the COVID restrictions being lifted and with the inventory being exhausted in the course of the first couple of months of the year. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, I'm just going to recap the process, because I think it's really important for your clients to understand. We are not imposing the supplementary declaration requirements in all these additional 23 fields because we want to. We're doing it because it's a legal requirement under the UCC. We have to do it. What we have done is to bifurcate the process by allowing people to use our CFSP authorizations. So the simplified frontier declaration is done early to get you over the frontier in the most simplified way possible. The counterfactual to this is that you do everything at the full frontier declaration, and then you would not be able to cross the frontier until you've filled those 23 fields. So by breaking it up into two, we're able to get you across the frontier and prioritize flow. But we still need the information for the supplementary declaration, and your declaration is not complete without it. So the process here, the first thing that needs to be dealt with, and continue to advise your clients on this, that you need to agree between the supplier and the importer what your Incoterms are. And there are a lot of factors that go into the choice of Incoterms. DDP is the only one, delivered duty paid, which puts the onus of the import declaration onto the GB supplier. In all other cases, it's the Northern Ireland importer that has the obligation to do the import declaration. You need to decide between the customer, the supplier or the importer, and their haulier company, who is the one who's going to produce the information. Now, there's a legal requirement or a legal responsibility that the entry summary declaration is the responsibility of the carrier, and the import declaration is the responsibility of the importer in all cases other than DDP. That is a legal responsibility, but that doesn't mean that the haulier has to produce all that information. You can agree between the haulier and the Northern Ireland importer or the GB supplier who's producing what information. The TSS portal will take it from multiple sources, but you need to decide who is doing it. Now, one of the issues is the way we've built the system. It's the ENS information, which typically is provided by the haulier, that generates the SFD, because it's the same information essentially for the most part. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. That is a decision between the hauliers and their customers. Once the SFD is generated, at the moment, the TSS will produce the MRNs for the carriers. There is one important point on this, which is that in the case of the simplified frontier declaration for SPS controlled and other controlled goods, that will go live into CDS on Monday. CDS is the customs, the new UK customs database. once that link goes live, it is CDS that produces the MRN. And on Monday, the risk we want to guard against is that if somebody has not put in, for example, the traces registration, the CHED, into the TSS portal, which then feeds into the CDS system, then CDS will not generate the MRN for that particular consignment. And if there's a truck moving to Liverpool, say, and there's one consignment on that truck for which there isn't an MRN, then the carrier will not get a GMR, and without a GMR, they will not be able to move through the ferry terminal. So it's obviously very important that everyone is doing what they need to do in terms of the SFD for controlled goods. If you're moving SPS goods or you're moving other controlled goods, you must put in the relevant information so that CDS can produce the MRN. Assuming that happens, then the goods can immediately go into Northern Ireland. They can be cleared into Northern Ireland premises. Delivery is completed. And we will ask for the extra information for the supplementary declaration, so that it typically has to be done by the 4th working day of the month following the month of the movement. This is when the duty is paid, if there is a duty to be paid for at-risk goods. And this is when you might use the waiver, or you will decide what to do in terms of your tariff, the tariff you'd have to pay. And what I emphasize here with respect to your clients is they need to have a strategy with respect to how they're going to do the supplementary declaration. They need to decide that strategy very early on, I mean, before now. And that strategy needs to be, what is the tariff that I should be paying? What is the way to minimize my tariff burden here? Because there are lots of things that you can do, and we'll walk through them in a second. But there are lots of things you can do to minimize the tariff. And it's very important that you advise your clients, fully on all those options. I'll go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about transit. This has been around for now 3 weeks, or maybe slightly more than that. There are only 2 ways of moving goods from GB to Northern Ireland using an Irish port. One is transit, and TSS supports that, and TSS has a transit service in place. The other is to do a direct export to Ireland, and then use the free circulation provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol to get stuff, wherever you need on the island of Ireland. If you're using number 2, that is basically an export as if it was an export to any European member state. So that will require the full exit summary declarations, entry summary declarations, export declarations from GB, import declarations into Ireland, just as if you were exporting out of GB into France or Holland. And so that's quite a lot of paperwork. And that's why the transit service exists. So that's why we don't support the second option. We're not going to do that, because TSS doesn't do goods movements into the European Union. What we do and what we focus on is movements into and out of Northern Ireland. So we will support transit. And if we go to the next slide, the way that transit, the reason you should use the transit service is that you obviously much less paperwork. You don't have to do, and I'll walk through the things that you have to do in the next slide, but you don't have to do, you don't have to engage with a lot of Irish customs processes, or indeed export processes out of GB. And Hans Maassen is one of the world's leading authorities on transit. He's former head of the Dutch Customs Brokers Association, and he's essentially looked at our transit process and thinks it's a highly simplified process, and it's innovative, pragmatic solutions. We're constantly evolving it. We're constantly making it better. And by better, I mean more user-friendly to traders. And we just encourage you to use it. We were initially quite surprised, because we were put, we had traders really saying to us, and hauliers saying to us, we must get this process up and running. We did, and then we didn't get the take up that we thought we would get. And certainly the use of Irish ports is down considerably from what you typically expect. Now, a lot of that is because of these processes, but we need to make them simpler so that people will use Irish ports if they need to. And if we go to the next slide. So this is how it works. You will go to the TSS portal, you'll submit your entry summary declaration in the usual way, but you'll select the GB/NI via IE route option. TSS will then send the transit template to you to complete and return. We will then send you the ENS MRN and the local reference number, the LRN, from which an MRN, transit MRN, is generated. You seal the truck before transit, and you would go to the office of departure. So if you're going Holyhead, Dublin, you'd go to the Road King facility in the Holyhead area. You'd start the transit, you collect the transit accompanying document, which would be printed out for you, along with the MRNs. We will notify Border Force that the transit movement has started. The only thing we ask hauliers to do that we don't do is the PBN, and there is a webinar that we will send links. We'll send links to all of the webinars that we've referred to here. To the the haulier needs to do the PBN notification, which is the equivalent of it fulfills the Office of Transit function in Ireland. It enables you to then cross to go from GB to Ireland, to go from Holyhead to Dublin in that case. In the webinar where we had the Irish Revenue Commission present on the PBN and what the process involves, I think you'll see that it's a very straightforward process and it's quite easy to do. I'm conscious that at the very beginning of the transit service there were some issues with the PBN. Those are resolved now, and I think it's proving to be quite a straightforward process. So you clear the Irish port and you continue to your Northern Ireland destination. The way the transit is closed is typically you use an authorized consignee location if you have that. The consignee would then end the transit on the transit convention, on the transit system, will contact us to confirm the goods have arrived, or you go to the office of destination. And there is an additional simplification where you can, if you've not heard from Border Force in the 6 hours from when we first notified them to at least 6 hours after that when you enter Northern Ireland, and we send that closing note to Border Force. If you haven't heard from them, then you can immediately unload at the point at your destination, your ordinary destination point. You don't have to go to the office of destination itself, and you'll confirm that the goods have arrived, and we will notify Border Force. And as I say, they may contact you in that 6 hour window, and they may tell you to go to one of the office of destinations in Belfast, Larne or Warren Point, and they might inspect your goods. This happens quite rarely, but obviously if they tell you to do that, you have to comply. And then what we'll do to completely close off the transit process is the SFD, which has been raised and held in the system from the point 1 there, it will be processed, and then you'll get the request for information for the supplementary declaration in the usual way. If we go to the next slide. We've had a lot of questions about before we go to Northern Ireland GB, there is an additional thing if you are moving SPS goods in transit. That is the one area where you are entering, it basically looks like an entry into Ireland. And therefore you need the appropriate SPS, the export health certificates, the traces registration, all of that needs to be done. It needs to be done on the Irish systems and the Irish authorities. A Northern Ireland importer can do it, but you have to be registered on the appropriate Irish system, the traces system, and so on. And you've got to provide your shed. You've got to do your traces registration 24 hours in advance of arrival. Now, the Northern Ireland, the DARA and the Border Control Post is a bit more flexible on this, and generally we'll look at 4 hours and won't require 24 hours, which is very difficult, obviously, if not impossible, for groupage hauliers to comply with. And we are working with the Irish authorities to get a bit more flexibility there, recognizing that there's a lot of goods that go from the east of England picked up in groupage and ultimately end up in Holyhead to go to Dublin, and it's not possible to do the traces registration 24 hours in advance for that last pickup. Now, SPS goods may be checked at the border control posts at the Irish ports of entry. This should not occur very frequently. A physical check should be very low percentages. At the moment, they're about 4%. And again, we're trying to ensure that the Irish percentage check, physical check, is as low as it possibly can do, and certainly consistent with the checking going on in Northern Ireland. If we go to the next slide. Options for NI to GB. There is a legal wrinkle here, which is that the Northern Ireland Protocol provides that you must do export declarations for products that are moving NI GB if they are moving in duty suspension. And it's that legal wrinkle that makes the transit route NI to GB via Ireland less attractive. Because normally you'd be using transit to avoid some of those export declarations. And in this particular case, you would have to do them anyway. So that's why TSS is not going to do a transit. Of course, if you are going NI to GB via Ireland and you want to use transit and you have your own haulier who has a transit guarantee and authorized consign all consignee locations, you're perfectly able to do those. But as I say, we are focusing our efforts on, obviously we do support NI to GB direct movements and export declarations that are required for those movements for the 14 treaty areas plus goods in duty suspension. And we will also move goods NI to GB via Ireland as an indirect export. Now we are doing a bit of that already for people who are basically using free circulation to get to the Irish port and then exporting out of Ireland and using the phased UK border to make the process into GB easier. But we will have a proper system set up very shortly that is a customs indirect export, as opposed to what people I think often call indirect export today. If you're moving goods NI to GB via Ireland as an indirect export, we will support it. It is effectively an export declaration with Northern Ireland as the place of export. So you use Belfast port as the port of export, even though the product's not going out of Belfast, and you use the Irish port, Dublin, Rosslare, wherever, as the place of exit or the port of exit. We'll do all the export declarations, which are NI to GB export declarations. The only thing, again, the trader or the haulier would have to do is to create the PVN on the Irish Ro-Ro system. That's the only thing that the haulier would have to do in addition. And we are working right now to just simplify. It's a simplified process getting into GB right now because of the phased border, but in July the phased border will go under the border operating model, and we'll have a new, we'll have a normal sort of UK border, and we are working to ensure that you don't have too many burdens if you're using this sort of route into GB. And we go to the next slide. I'm now going to hand over to Frank to talk about consignment first, which is the model that we've adopted for, particularly for groupage hauliers, which I think is getting quite a lot of positive response and take up. So Frank.
Thank you, Shankar. And I'll take you through, we'll share these slides. So I'll take you through the diagram view of this to explain it on the next slide. But on the slide we just exited there is a user guide link, so you can actually see online what this means. And I'll move through this fairly quickly because I think the audience is not predominantly haulage companies and groupage or freight forwarders. So a flavour of what this is. When the first release of the TSS, when we started, our users would put their data in three sections to create the declarations: the Entry Safety and Security Declaration and the Simplified Frontier Declaration. And the three sections we call header, consignment, and items. So the header is the first page as you hit, and you'll put in the vehicle details, the journey details, and dates, and then you would add consignments to that vehicle. So once you've created that header record, you can then start adding consignments into the vehicle. And the consignments are the description of the goods that are moving from a consignor to a consignee, from the supplier to the buyer. And the vehicle may have one consignment, so it may be taking a shipment for just one transaction between a supplier and a buyer, or it may take many, and in some instances even hundreds. So those consignments are then created, consignment records are created on the record, and then finally you need to add in items. So for each of those consignments, you need to describe the items that are being included in that consignment. Depending on the nature of those items, it could be a description, and if there are controlled items, it will be more details and commodity codes, etc. And once all that is submitted and all the information is there, you can hit the submit button, and declarations are created. So the entry safety and security declaration created predominantly from the header, and then the simplified frontier declaration from the middle records there of consignment and items. And that process works quite well for many. If we go to the next slide, we then had feedback from predominantly from what we call the groupage sector, where a vehicle is carrying consignments from multiple suppliers, so they're carrying multiple loads. And the problem there is they tend to work back to front with the model that we introduced, which is they'll do the consignments first and then they'll decide which vehicle it goes in. So we very, very quickly, in record time, upgraded our system and produced a new release in February to include what we call the Consignment Model, which allows a trader to create consignments standalone and then allocate them to a haulier. This has a number of benefits, which I'll highlight in this process. So the procedure is the trader, and then we've got trader 1 and trader 2 there, obviously can be many traders, can now create a consignment standalone. So we can have trader 1 could be a paint company, and they might have sold 3 tins of paint to a customer in Northern Ireland. So this is going from GB to Northern Ireland. They can enter that consignment, that order, onto the system under their account, and so it will be the consignment details will be who the supplier is and who the buyer is, and the items will be a description of the items that are included in that order. So in our case, the example I gave you is some tins of paint. And the same with trader 2, they can start putting their orders on. They can save those consignments, but they can't submit them, so they don't go anywhere. They stay on the TSS. You can't create a declaration from that process. The next step is they then decide, of course, they want to arrange transport, so they'll contact their transporter of choice. Once they've agreed the transaction, the transport, they'll then allocate those consignments to the transporter, and they do that by just putting the EORI number of the haulier into that consignment. And once that is done, the consignment pops up on the haulier's menu, and so the haulier then has a list of consignments that are allocated to them from their customers. They will then do their planning, their manifest planning for their vehicle journeys, and once they've decided which consignments are going on which vehicle and which routes, they can build their manifest by creating the header for that vehicle, and they just pull the consignments that they are relevant into that particular header to create the manifest for the vehicle. So they can then submit that record, and it creates the 2 declarations, the declaration for the entry and safety security, and the declarations for each of the consignments that are on the vehicle, the frontier consignments. A couple of benefits in there is you've now got much easier workload sharing. So the haulier or the freight forwarder doesn't have to put the consignments in, and you've got this separation of duties there. So it can stay on the trader's account, and the carriage can stay on the haulier's account. The other area that's made easier is we don't transfer the pricing or commercial details of those items to the carrier. So trader 1 and trader 2 may both be in the DIY sector and competitors using the same haulier, but their pricing is not being made visible in this process. It stays with their transactions. So that's a little bit about the groupage model. So both models exist today. You can do the traditional header first, or you can do consignment first model. And on the next page, excuse me, as with all of our releases, we have a demonstration video, and on the previous page there was a link to the document guide as well. So you've got a video and a document guide on how to use this. So that's the first of our new releases. There are 3 releases that came out recently. The second one is on simplified frontier declarations. And we've upgraded our simplified frontier declaration process to have more fields for the controlled and SPS goods. So now you have to enter more detail if you choose the option that your goods are either controlled goods or SPS goods, and you'll need to put commodity codes and document codes that are relevant to that particular product when you create the simplified frontier declaration. So this is an important change. And on the next slide, I'll hand over to Shankar to talk us through. Oh, actually, if I cover this bit, it'll be probably a little bit easier, I think. Just so the SPS goods, if we use that as a use case, control goods is similar. The procedure here is the seller and the buyer have different responsibilities. In the case of food and animal product goods, the buyer is the buyer and the seller obviously agree a transaction. The seller will have to organise the export health certificate if that's required, and the buyer is the person responsible for the traces submission, which creates the CHED, the Common Health Entry document. An agent can do these, but it's important that the responsibility sits in those areas. And then, depending on the Incoterms, the import declaration is created as well. And on our next slide, which I won't go to in great detail, there is a flow chart that shows how this process works for SPS goods. I think the point to stress on this is there is a set of processes that you need in terms of preparation if you're moving SPS goods and control goods. So, for example, on the left-hand side there, at the bottom, we've got this process of arranging the health certificates, submitting the traces record, and creating the CHED form. The vehicle has to be sealed. There has to be a veterinary inspection. So that process needs 24 hours notice before the vehicle is able to leave the depot. And it produces certificates that need to be created, and sorry, not created. It produces certificates with certificate numbers, so the CHED and the export health certificate and the seal number, which need to go on those various components. So, for example, the export health certificate number and the seal number of the container need to be placed on the CHED form. And the number for the CHED form needs to go on the declaration documents when you raise the simplified frontier declaration. So a couple of points to stress around this process. For control goods and SPS goods, there's pre-work to be done before you get to the declaration phase. There are important reference numbers depending on the commodity codes and documents. Those need to go on the relevant systems. In this case, we've got Traces and Echo. They also need to be entered into the declaration. And what we're stressing there is please make sure that those reference numbers are the same. If those reference numbers are out of kilter, then the declaration will be invalid, and there will be a check in the not too distant future between those systems, and it will reject at the declaration phase if those numbers are inconsistent. The rest of the process is pretty much as Shankar described previously. Once the declarations are in place, you can then transport the goods into Northern Ireland. And on the next slide, we just put a holding slide there for the Traces system, so you can link to, you do need to be registered if your customers need to be registered on Traces if they are moving food and animal and plant product, food and product of animal and plant origin. Is probably the best way of saying it. So there's a link then, a reminder that those need to be used. One of the things to stress here is you're probably aware of the easement for supermarkets and their suppliers. There is an easement in place now. So if you're a supermarket moving food products or you're a supplier to a supermarket, you don't need to do the health certificate, and you don't need to do the full detailed frontier declaration in terms of listing all of the commodity codes at that point, but you do need the CHED form and you need the CHED reference number in order to move to Northern Ireland. So there was some confusion there that some organisations thought you don't need to do the CHED. So with the various easements, it's really important to make sure that you understand the full details of the nature of those easements. And on the next page, please, Jen. This is a kind of this is an extract from one of our user guides, and the reason why we're showing this is because the Simplified Frontier Declaration, as I mentioned, the latest release now, which came out on the 15th, now asks you to enter more fields than it did before. So we've increased the number of fields, so the complexity is increased a little bit, and it's part of the phasing approach of TSS that we're gradually moving, the requirements to the full requirements in phases. So this latest iteration means if you enter a commodity code that is for a product of animal or plant origin, it will need a document code associated with that commodity code. In this case, N853, which is a CHED form, and the CHED form is the Common Health Entry Document. So if you don't enter the document number on the declaration and you don't enter the reference number for that document on the declaration, you will get one of those lovely error codes when you try and submit the declaration. There are many document codes, and there are many commodity codes on the CDS system. So we can't go through all of them, and we certainly can't do that in the seminar. So the approach we've got here is in the user guide, it shows you how to find out if your commodity code has a relevant document code, a required document code. So you will need to look up on the Northern Ireland online tariff tool, you'll need to look up your commodity code. You can scroll down and see that there is a condition, and we've highlighted in that box there, the box on the left-hand side, the orange box on the left-hand side, it says condition. If you click on condition, you get the box on the right-hand side that says veterinary control document code N853 is required. And then we show you where that goes into the declaration field on TSS. So it's a bit painting by numbers, and it does mean you've got to look stuff up to start with. And once you've done this process, you now know that commodity needs N853 and it goes in that box. So when you've done this once, it should be repeatable work for your future declarations. We put a link on the web page on the slide there to the web pages that are relevant to this, but this is just a small excerpt from the documentation, the user guide documentation. Whilst I'm there, on the error code side, we know that organisations that are submitting declarations now, particularly on supplementary declarations, they are getting error codes. We also have improving the guidance around those error codes, so that's also available on the portal as well. And on the next slide, I think it's the video link. Yeah, there we go. So we have a video link. It's well worth watching. It's a little bit longer, this one, but this walks you through how to create the new Simplified Frontier Declaration for controlled goods. So you've got the video and the how-to guide as well. And on the next slide.
And Frank, before we go into subdecks, if I can just add a couple of things that are really important that I want people to be very aware of. One is there was some confusion about the sort of TSS definition of controlled goods in the portal. So just to repeat, that includes all SPS goods for our purposes. I'm very conscious that there is a definition of customs controlled goods that does not include all SPS goods, only sort of things like category 1 meat and bone meal and specific, things like that. For our purposes, when you get to the portal and it says, is it a controlled good? If it's any SPS good, any good to which SPS applies, it is a controlled good. You must enter the controlled, you must enter that into the portal, because if you don't, you won't get the prompt for the CHED documentation and so on, and you won't be able to fill it up properly. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Monday, as I said before, the SFD for controlled good goes live into CDS. We were very concerned about a month ago that the non-compliance rate for putting the CHED in was about, and what I mean by that is people were not even doing traces registrations 30% of the time. So it's not just getting it wrong, it's 30% of the time they weren't doing it at all. If that happens on Monday, then we are going to get trucks stopped outside Liverpool. So it's really important that this works properly on Monday. It was going to be put in place on February the 15th. We were very concerned. Everyone was very concerned about the non-compliance rate. So we managed to give another, 3 weeks to get it right. But there is no flexibility now. We've already had 3 weeks extra time. Really important to make sure this is done correctly. As Frank said, if I can underscore, just because you're on the supermarket easement, just because you're on the authorized trader scheme and you don't have to do export health certificates, that does not mean you don't do traces registrations. You must do traces registrations. So that's just a few things I wanted to clarify before Frank sort of takes us into the subject piece of the agenda.
Thanks, Shankar. So we've covered groupage and we've covered the Simplified Frontier Declaration enhancement. The third part of the release that went in mid-February is the Supplementary Declaration process. So I'll take you through Supplementary Declaration procedures. So that went live on the 15th, and we'll just talk through and highlight the key features of that. Again, there is a video and documentation on that process, but we'll take you through the key features of it. So in terms of timelines and how the process works, if you're moving goods today in it's March the 4th, then typically it's a day or so to get those goods arriving at their destination, Northern Ireland. So you submit your declarations and then the goods arrive next day or same day. What that does is it triggers within the TSS an email that goes to the importer of those goods. So the important factor here is the importer is the EORI number that is in the importer field on the Simplified Frontier Declaration. So there's a number of EORI numbers in the Simplified Frontier Declaration. You need to look for the importer field, and it'll be that one that we send the email to saying, can you please complete a supplementary declaration for the goods you've just received. That needs to be completed by the 4th of the following working month. So if you move goods today, you may get the email tomorrow. The submission for the supplementary declaration would happen on the 4th of April, if that's the 4th working day of April. What we've also noticed, recent feedback on this, is a couple of things to mention here is people are finding it difficult to reconcile the Frontier Declaration with the goods that were received. I know that might sound a bit odd to some of us, but the email will tell them which Frontier Declaration this is concerning, but they don't necessarily have all of the detail on that Frontier Declaration. So organizations need to think about their goods in process and how they're keeping records that they can easily reconcile the their deliveries with the corresponding Frontier Declaration. And that's catching a few people out, and it's making it difficult to raise this simplified supplementary declaration. So please be aware of that one. It's the supplementary declaration. Its main purpose is to close out the process. So the TSS has used simplified procedures to get the goods out of Great Britain and into Northern Ireland. So it's minimum data in most situations. We then, the supplementary declaration is completing that data set. And included in that are things like determination of the at-risk and not at-risk factor, and calculation if a duty is due or not. So it's an important item to get right. And on the next slide, there is a video. So we've got the link to the video as well as the documentation on how to do that. And I'll hand over to Shankar because we wanted to lift out some important points. We won't show you how to do the declaration, that's on the guide. It would take the whole seminar to do that, but we wanted to pull out some key themes and key items to be aware of on the subdeck, and also the at-risk determination. And I'll hand over to Shankar for that.
Thanks, Frank. And this is really crucial for your clients. So at the high level, I would say what your clients need to do as they're about to do the supplementary declaration is they've got to have a strategy for how they are going to deal with the supplementary declaration with respect to the tariff that might or might not be applicable. What you need to do is look at the TSS online guides, the declaration data requirements. That tells you about the fields, what you have to put in, all of that. That sort of base information. But the crucial thing here is the difference between at-risk and not at-risk goods. And you need to go back to the header and make sure that's been correctly done. There are two additional information codes that you need to be putting in. One is NI-DOM. That is for goods moving GB to NI under free circulation. The other is NI-IMP, which is for goods moving under special procedures. Most people will be moving NI-DOM. It's really important that you enter the right one, because the architecture takes you to a completely different place if you enter the wrong one. So NI-DOM for the most part. Once you do the supplementary declaration, if you're on the UK trader scheme, and I'll talk in a bit about exactly how you get on that and what it is and so on, but if you're on the UK trader scheme so that you are a not at risk trader, that doesn't stop the process. You can't rely on just being a UK TS trader in order to get the zero tariff because your goods movement is in the single customs territory. You need to additionally put in this additional information code, NI-REM. That's what will get you the zero tariff. If you don't put it in, if you leave it blank, then then you may end up with, depending on what else you've filled in, you may end up with a duty because you've not complied, you've not satisfied the rules of origin in the trade agreement, for example. The other additional information code is NI-AID, which is the waiver. That's the subsidy for paying the duty up to the level of the European de minimis state aid rules, which is €200,000 for 3 fiscal years. And what we're saying to small traders, if you have clients who are very small traders, who might be, for example, as a rule of thumb, that €200,000 for 3 fiscal years translates to roughly, for a 4% typical industrial goods tariff, to about £1.5 million of trade coming in from GB to NI. If you're in that sort of category, then it may be best for you simply to put NI-AID, not worry about the UK trader scheme, not worry about the rules of origin, not worry about the trade agreement, and just say, look, we're just going to claim the subsidy because it pretty much covers all the duties we would ever have to pay. You type in NI-AID, and then you don't have to worry about paying duties because your subsidy takes care of it. You will need to put additional information into the supplementary declaration, which are import commodity codes, licenses, some of the controls. That's all to be found on the guidance that's linked there. There's the EU tariff guide also for commodity codes. But we've summarized all of this on the NI Customs Trade Academy website. If we go to the next slide. So basically what you need to do in terms of your strategy for deciding whether what duty you're going to have to pay is you need to think about whether you would be a not at risk trader and whether your goods movements would be not at risk. The reason this is so important is because in the Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland is in the UK customs territory. That means if you're a not at risk trader, you're moving goods entirely within the UK customs territory. And if you're doing that, there is no application of the UK-EU TCA. There is no concern about rules of origin. It is like, from a tariff perspective, it's like you moving goods from one part of GB to another part of GB. So, I mean, that's not true in terms of the customs process piece, but I'm just talking about the tariff piece right now. So, what you would do, and we've created a bit of a decision tree for GB to NI trade. The first question you ask is the EU duty zero? The reason for this is that is the common external tariff. That's the tariff rate of the EU to all countries. I mean, i.e. countries that it doesn't have a trade agreement with. If it's zero, then you're automatically not at risk because there's never a duty to pay. That's the default there. If it's not zero, in most cases it won't be zero, you have to ask yourself, can I be on the UK TS itself? There you have to show control over your GB to NI movements. You need to know where product is going. You can't simply be moving things to a LODS distribution facility and it could be going literally anywhere on the island of Ireland. You have to have that level of control. In addition to that, there are certain things like you need to not have a history of customs violations. You need to have an XIE ORI number. you need to be selling to consumer-facing facilities, which could be retail or wholesale selling to retail. You cannot use the UK trader scheme if the good is subject to an EU trade defence measure. So that would be the case for steel, for example, where there's a special safeguard in place now that is a quota for steel and a 25% tariff if you're above the quota, because it's a response to the US action, or the national security action on steel imports into the US. The EU retaliated in this way. If you're a trade defence measure, trade remedy, anti-dumping action, whatever it happens to be, you cannot be on the UK trader scheme. Then if your goods are being commercially processed in Northern Ireland, so you're making a product that's commercially processed from product coming in from GB, and that good can go anywhere in the island of Ireland, because it's commercial processing, there's a default to at risk, but there are significant exceptions to this. The first exception is a small trader exception, or a small processor exception. That is, if your sales are less than £500,000, then even if you don't come into the commercial processing exceptions that I'm about to lay out, you're always going to be exempt from the general default to at risk, and you can be not at risk provided you satisfy the other requirements. So what are those other exceptions? Food, construction, goods for not-for-profit activities. We have a webinar on this, and we have a tariff guide that goes into great detail about exactly what these criteria are and how it operates. And we'd certainly want you to review that quite closely. The other requirement here that has caused a few problems, I think, is this requirement to have a Northern Ireland facility, a real Northern Ireland facility with real employees and so on. That there was a temporary easement on that, where you did not have to show that in order to get on the UK trader scheme. That temporary easement has been extended until October. So our advice to you is, if that is the only reason you were not applying to the UK trader scheme, that should not be a reason. You should apply to the UK trader scheme, because you've got an easement for a long period of time, and none of us know what the future is going to be. So there is no, from a business standpoint, there is no downside risk to being on the UK trader scheme. It's free. You make a simple application. You don't need to show that you have a Northern Ireland facility. It's not retroactive. So even if that does change down the line and you can't satisfy it, they aren't going to try to claw back tariffs that you might have had to pay in the past. So from a business standpoint, there is absolutely no reason not to be on the UK trader scheme. There is no downside risk, and there is significant upside. And there is also significant, beyond that, upside potential, because obviously if there are further simplifications and easements as we go forward, a lot of those will be built into the UK trader scheme, because it is a movement entirely within the UK customs territory, so it can avail itself of more simplifications and easements going forward. I don't know that that's going to happen. It may never happen, but it is possible that it would happen, and if it does, it's for the UK trader scheme. So you need to be on it in order to benefit from those simplifications if they happen in the future as well. So again, I'm saying this because we were very surprised about the low take-up of the UK trader scheme, very surprised and very concerned about the low take-up of the UK trader scheme. It was negotiated by the UK government. It exists for you to use. It's really important that you start using it. If you can't qualify for the UK trader scheme, then there is, of course, the de minimis waiver capacity that I mentioned. It is really important for very small traders. It may be best for you, and the advice that you guys will give to your clients who are very small traders should be, it may be best for you just to go straight to this, because why go through all the process of the trade agreement? Just claim the waiver. And there's a website there to where you can claim the waiver on your goods. You have to register for this, so you actually need to do this. So it's again a two-step process: register for the waiver and then put NI aid on your supplementary declaration. Now, if the UK TS doesn't apply to you and the EU common external tariff is not 0, and you can't use the waiver, or you're trading too much for the waiver to be particularly useful to you, you are required to then you would then look at the EU UK TCA to see if you can claim the preferential 0 tariff, and that depends on the rules of origin in the agreement. The rules of origin are very specific to different product categories, so you need to check your product category. There is a whole practice in rules of origin analysis, and it isn't sufficient. Usually it's not going to be enough just to have substantial transformation of the product in GB, or change in tariff classification as it goes into Northern Ireland. You usually have a local content requirement as well under the UK EU TCA. You have an additional problem, which is the Percy Pigs problem, which is if you've got product coming from continental Europe going into GB, it's not being further processed. It's therefore a secondary movement into Northern Ireland, and it may be susceptible to a tariff because there isn't UK origin depending on the EU content. There are rules in the trade agreement for bilateral cumulation, which essentially takes the UK content and the EU content and allows you to use both to determine whether it's UK origin when it goes into, or GB origin when it goes into Northern Ireland. But those rules don't solve the onward processing problem. Yes, if you are processing it in GB, you can benefit from bilateral accumulation, but if you're not, you may end up having to pay a tariff. And because the rules of origin in the EU UK TCA are quite restrictive in many ways, you need to really check this, because it may very well be that a client of yours who thinks that they've entered free circulation in GB, and then surely, of course, that means there's no tariff. Actually, that's not true, and they might end up having to pay a tariff. So you need to explain all of that to them. If we go to the next slide, this is an at-risk decision tree for rest of world to Northern Ireland trade, which is very similar to the previous decision tree with a few notable exceptions, or a few notable differences. The first is that there'll always be a tariff. If it's rest of world to Northern Ireland, it's either going to be the UK global tariff, or it's going to be the European Union common external tariff. How you determine which one you have to pay is determined by this decision tree. So you'd look at the EU duty, and if it's lower than the UK duty, then it's not at risk and you pay the UK duty. Now that most of the cases of the UK global tariff, the tariff is lower than the European tariff. The UK global tariff was a simplification in many ways of the European tariff and a lowering of it in significant ways. So usually usually the answer to that will be no. And then you will have to ask if the trader has UK TS authorization, much in the same way that we discussed in the previous decision tree. There is one difference here, which is if the EU tariff rate is more than 3% higher than the UK duty, that is automatically going to be an at-risk movement. The reason for this is not because there's some logic that says that should be the case, is because that was the agreement in the joint committee. The EU is obviously concerned about potential for smuggling, and essentially said, well, if it's more than 3%, the incentive to smuggle is very high, and therefore we're going to say all of these things are at risk. And that was just a negotiation between the UK and the EU. So you would then ask the question about whether it's subject to EU defence measures, trade defence measures. Then you go into the questions about commercial processing exceptions. Do they potentially apply? And of course, to be on the UK TS, you have to be selling to consumer-facing facilities, which could be retail or wholesale selling to retail, as I said before. So that will determine whether you're at risk or not at risk. That will determine whether you pay the EU duty or the UK duty. If we go to the next slide. So just to summarize, the 4 checks that you will perform: EU common external tariff, is it 0? Can I be on the UK trader scheme? Remember that if you are on the UK trader scheme, it is not sufficient to just leave it there. You have to actually put the NIREM code in your supplementary declaration. If I can't qualify for either of those, I have to check the preferential rules of origin in the trade agreement. have to determine whether I can claim that preferential rate of 0, and it's non-trivial to do that. You have to understand the local content requirements. You have to understand whether this is a secondary movement or whether you're actually doing some processing in the UK so that you can claim the bilateral accumulation with the EU. So that's a fairly complex process, and that's why we're saying with the duty waiver, if you're very small, don't subject your clients, your very small clients, to that whole complicated process. Take them straight to the duty waiver and say, look, you're going to be able to not pay a tariff at all in doing this. But that's not to say there are no other benefits of the UK trader scheme. As I said before, there may be other things in the future. It might be worth doing it, but you can always apply for it at that time. There is an application process. The provisional authorization expired on February the 28th. That was a very simple process where you simply fill in the form and you're provisionally authorized. But that does not mean that you can't register now for the scheme. You can and you must if you can benefit from it. But there will be a process where HMRC will evaluate whether you are eligible for it. But that process doesn't take, it's no more than a month, could be less than that. Again, really important. I can really stress the importance of the UK trader scheme. If none of that applies, then your goods are at risk, and you will and you can't qualify under preferential rules of origin. Then you are going to pay a duty. The only way to avoid that duty is to use customs special procedures, and that might be a customs warehouse. It might be some other customs process that you would want to use, and certainly you should be advising your clients on those processes that are available. And the key here is, if you want to avoid the sort of failing the rule of origin test, then the way to do that is to not enter the goods in free circulation in GB. If they're coming from Europe and they're going into GB and they're not in free circulation and they then go to Northern Ireland via transit, you don't have to worry about the terms of the EU-UK TCA and the rules of origin to claim the 0 duty. So if we go to the next slide, and that's a link to Northern Ireland Customs Trade Academy. There is a huge amount of information on here. We've had about almost 300,000 downloads of material on the Northern Ireland Customs Trade Academy website. It really is it is a university for customs, and really strongly encourage all of the people in the sort of intermediary sort of market, lawyers, accountants, customs intermediaries to really use that material. I don't think there's ever been a case like this where so much material has been put on a single source site for customs processes, and absolutely, definitely, please make use of all of that. So with that, I think that's the end of the presentation. I know a lot of the questions have been answered, both in the presentation itself, looking at the questions, and also by us in real time during the presentation. So I don't know if we have other questions or questions that haven't been answered, but we can certainly go into Q&A now.
Thanks, Shankar. Yes, as you said, there have been a lot of questions put in, and your guys have been working behind the scenes answering loads of them. I will look at a couple here that don't look like they have been answered, and we can take that from there. Okay, so you say there's a legal requirement for businesses to complete and submit supplementary declarations. What is the position for business if there's no record of the movement on TSS, and so they cannot fulfill their obligation of submitting the subdec?
So I mean, there should be a record. There should be an SFD on there. If the goods are across the frontier, there would have to be an SFD in order to do that. If it's on TSS, then I know that there is a sort of difficult process of reconciliation of the SFD with the subdec. We would encourage all businesses to keep records of the SFDs, so you can actually do that reconciliation process. So there should be. If there isn't, it's because the SFD has been generated by somebody else, or a fool customs declaration has been generated by somebody else. In other words, you've not been using the TSS system, and so obviously, if you're not using the TSS system, you need to determine what your obligations might be based on the intermediary that you did use. But I wonder, Frank, if you can talk about the reconciliation process, because I think that is part of where this question is coming from.
Yeah, there's a few things to highlight, I think. First of all, if the Frontier Declaration was made before the 15th of February, then the request won't come through to create the Supplementary Declaration. So anything that was created before the 15th of February will stay in TSS, and you can't create a Supplementary Declaration for that just yet. And that's because those records in the TSS don't have the full set of data in order for those to be submitted to CDS. So they're, in effect, entry into declarants record on our system. So if it's one of those prior to the 15th, you won't know about that one. If you think you should have some declarations, then you can contact your suppliers and see if they've submitted those declarations with the right information. You can potentially ask for more detailed information from the TSS as well, who can do reports for you on the system. So they can look up the various VORI codes for you on the system, if that helps as well. On the reconciliation side, as Shanker mentioned, excuse me, the email that comes through to you, I'm trying to think through the process, the email that comes through to you will have a link to the Simplified Frontier Declaration. But if it doesn't have enough information on it, then you'll need to get some sort of packing list or a purchase order or a related invoice for that particular movement. And at the moment, that's probably going to be a question of going back to the supplier and using that declaration reference number with your supplier to get that information. What we should be doing going forward is making sure that those references are attached to the declarations as part of the end-to-end process.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that will address some of those queries. This is probably fairly common among a lot of the companies. My client estimates that he would need to employ 4 additional staff to complete the supplementary declarations required. This would make his business financially unviable. What, if any, assistance is available with these additional costs?
So I think for a lot of the smaller traders, the best thing to do here is actually to use a customs intermediary to do this. Now I am conscious that it's quite difficult. Well, it's not difficult. It's we do get a lot of intermediaries who enter information on TSS on behalf of their clients. We are thinking about how to make it easier for intermediaries to interface with TSS. It's not a trivial problem because TSS is an indirect representative for the purpose of customs. Which means we take on the liabilities. And if you have an intermediary that isn't an indirect representative, then they're sort of piggybacking onto an indirect representative, and there's some legal liability challenges that we have to work through. But our intention certainly is to try to figure out how to make it easier for intermediaries. Now, if you use an intermediary and you're very small, there are a lot of grants that Intertrade Ireland and other people, the UK government as well, gives you to help you, pay for intermediaries and so on. Now, obviously, if you're using an intermediary, the intermediary will charge you for entering that information on the TSS. TSS is completely free, so just understand that there's no charge for TSS. So if some intermediary says to your client, "Well, I'll do it for the same sort of amount that I would charge for doing a customs declaration," then understand they are overcharging you because TSS does all of that. All they have to do is enter the information on a portal, which is considerably less than what you'd normally be doing if you were an intermediary. So it should be a much lower charge. So I will say that sort of, up front. But that's probably the best that we can, suggest right now. It shouldn't be a significant charge if you use an intermediary to do this.
Okay. This one is about trust between, I suppose, the supplier and the company. So they're asking, can we trust our supplier? That currently they have 2 deliveries from this particular company on the TSS portal, although they have received around 10. And they're wondering, is there anything more that they need to do from their end?
Well, when you say trust, are we talking about the responsibility for completing the import declaration?
Is, yeah.
In other words, how do we know it's going to be done properly, and are we going to bear some responsibility? Well, if you are on anything other than DDP terms, it's the Northern Ireland importer that has to do the import declaration. I think there was another question about who is responsible for the subdec. It is, again, unless you're on DDP terms, it's always the Northern Ireland importer that's going to be responsible for both the SFD and the supplementary declaration, because they're responsible for the import declaration. So they need to be doing it. So absolutely. But we will, once you've done the SFD, as part of the subdec field, you put in your Incoterms. So, but even before that, the TSS will come to the right person with a request for further information, so the subdec can be raised. So if we haven't come to you, if you haven't heard from TSS, and you know that TSS has been used to raise the initial declaration, then that's because we've gone to somebody else who's responsible for doing that, and that's relative to your commercial arrangement with that person. If they're not doing what they are what they're legally required to do in order to transport products to you, then they're most probably violating the terms of your contract anyway, and you'd want to deal with that accordingly.
Yeah, great, thank you. So this question is around, they are a Northern Ireland based company who buys goods from a GB supplier, but the goods are being delivered directly to a Republic of Ireland customer, i.e. the goods do not physically enter Northern Ireland. So the company in Northern Ireland receives a sales invoice from the GB supplier, and they're asking what declarations are required for this movement.
So customs follows goods, not the financial arrangements or the financial structure of the transaction. So if the goods are going from GB to Ireland directly, then that is just like a movement from GB to France or Holland, if they're going through Dublin port or through Rosslare or through any of the Irish ports, and that will require a full set of export declarations out of GB or UK, and a full set of import declarations into Ireland. The only difference would be if some of these products are going from UK or GB ports to, let's say, Warren Point, for example, in Northern Ireland, and that the way they go is they go to Warren Point and then they're picked up by somebody in Ireland and that's how the trade goes. In that case, there is something you can do with TSS, which is that could be a GB to Northern Ireland at-risk movement, and provided there's a Northern Ireland entity that can be registered on TSS, it can avail itself of that, and it can be an at-risk movement, and that may be the process that's favoured by this particular company. The one thing the TSS can't do is it can't act for an Irish importer. So you can't have an Irish importer registered on TSS, but the Irish importer could have an agent in Northern Ireland. It could have a subsidiary in Northern Ireland. Many people are using Northern Ireland hauliers to register on TSS to do precisely this kind of movement. So subject to that sort of exception, no, TSS wouldn't be involved. It would be a straight export into Ireland.
Okay, thank you. So another question around state aid and the at-risk. So Peter's asking, can we get some clarity as to the application of state aid to duties where applicable to at-risk goods? Is this to be self-accounted for using the code? And how does it work for DDP goods where you're relying really on the supplier to do it?
Yeah, so if it's DDP, the supplier would do the declaration. And the supplier would be responsible for the pay, but because you're DDP, they would be responsible for payment of the tariff and so on. And so they would use their state aid's de minimis amount if that was applicable. So that wouldn't be you, because you wouldn't be hit by the tariff anyway on DDP terms. If in all other cases, you'll want to use, if it's applicable, you'd want to use your waiver. It is self-declared in the sense that you put in NI aid into your supplementary declaration. There is a responsibility on you to make sure that you haven't gone through your ceiling and that you are aware of what state aids you receive, because it's a total amount. So that 200,000 euros over a 3-year period is for everything that you've received. So it's not only the duty, it's also any other state aid you might have received or are receiving in the course of that 3-year period. And it's up to you to know what that is. So there's no internal mechanism where that is automatically taken into account. You need to police that yourself. But for the majority of very small traders, they won't have received any. The state aid would be any sort of payment from the UK government, and they probably won't have received that. And if you have, it will be obvious. You will know that you received that money. So you would offset that against the 200,000.
Great, thank you. An interesting question about packaging. So this company, we bring in packaging from GB, which has French origin and has EU tariffs. This may end up being used on product which could be sold back to the EU. Does this mean it is at risk? And they're just emphasizing it's not a component subject to processing, it's purely packaging.
Yeah, I mean, there are special rules on packaging and containers and all kinds of other things that allow you in some cases to make oral declarations. And there's also temporary importation rules that allow you to not have to do the full customs declaration, especially if they're going back into the EU. You certainly, and we've got guidance on both temporary importation and packaging and pallets and containers. So we'll make sure we get the link onto those provisions now.
I think on this case, it sounds like the packaging is part of the final product, and typically that's priced with the product. So when you're doing your business model, you've got your component parts, your finishing parts, and your packaging and your shipping, pricing, etc. And if that's going out as a complete product, then packaging is part of that process, and it is part of the value of the goods. So the packaging is a raw material perhaps coming in to be processed as part of that final procedure. So needed a little bit more detail on that one. And if you can fire us an email with those details, we can look into the specifics of how you could treat that packaging, because it could fall into either. Typically, you can exclude packaging if it's done to transport the goods and it returns with an empty vehicle, etc. Then that typically is excludable, but it does need looking at. So I think this one sounds like it needs to be accounted for in the goods.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, again, we are out of time. We've got through loads of the questions, but there are still some there. So I know the last time you were kind enough to have a look at the questions for us and we were able to answer them. So if you don't mind, we'll do that again. So thank you, Shankar and Frank, for really interesting, informative presentation. There was so much detail in there, and I think particularly for people helping their clients, looking at making sure they're registered for the trader service, as you said about the uptake being low on that, and all the pieces around waivers as well. So really interesting, and thank you also to Dan, who has been beavering away answering all those questions in the background, which meant we were able to get through those final few. So I hope everybody on the call has enjoyed it and found it useful. I just wish you all a lovely afternoon and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.